Oh, well, I didn't put the microphone in. Oh, shoot.
Well, I tell you what, if I get my husband to go south, we could go south.
Think?
Yep, I know I would.
People are going to think there's a hurricane going on.
We're not trying to get rid of you, but you do have the equipment to do it.
I don't want to go by myself. Okay.
Ken is just going to do these short trips. He's not going to go for the winter.
All right, well, we'll see if it picks up the mic.
How will we know?
Well, it'll still pick it up on my computer mic, but it's always better through this. They'll still be able to hear it.
That's the green light's on, is it?
Yeah, but I forgot to plug it in before, so
What do you think? It's not charged?
never mind.
That's not what you mean.
You have to set it up that way.
Well, we're about ready to begin. I think we're set up. So, we're about to finish up Numbers. Have you enjoyed being in Numbers of all things? Glenn Ogden, what did you say to me when you walked in this morning?
Good morning.
No, besides that. You did say that, by the way. You commented on what the lesson was about.
We didn't have a talking mule today.
They didn't have a talking donkey today. That's right. How do you top that, right? But that's what we had last week. I was thinking through the book, and I skimmed the book of Numbers this week when I was getting ready for today. And I thought, I wonder when they put this together. You only got so many weeks that they wanted to cover Numbers, and then they're going to devote the rest of this quarter to Deuteronomy. Why they didn't use the Numbers 20 passage. And so, I meant to have my Bible over here, and I'm negligent of my duties.
You were talking too much.
I was talking too much and picking on people. Look at Numbers 20 with me, if you will, and you'll understand why this is such an important verse, because it ends up being quoted pretty much by Jesus in the New Testament. Verses 2 through 13 of chapter 20 go kind of like this. The children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried. That's Moses' sister. Now, there was no water for the congregation, and you know how this goes. And Moses and Aaron, is that where I want to be? That's not where I want to be. Let's try that again. Is it 20?
20's water from the rock.
I don't want water from the rock. I want the snakes.
21 verse 4, I think.
Where's it at?
Looks like maybe 21 verse 4.
Oh, was it in there? Okay, I just hadn't got to it.
21.
21, I was in 20. Okay, I wrote it down wrong. Okay, 21 verse 4, yeah. Look at chapter 21 verse 4. Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt? How many times have they said that? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread, the manna from heaven. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people, and then the Lord said to Moses, Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and so it was, if a serpent bit anyone, and he looked upon the bronze serpent, he lived. Now, the passage of scripture that I'm referring to is also in John chapter 3:14. And I'm sure you're familiar with that, but it's referring back to this Numbers passage. And if I can get my fingers to get to John 3 real quick here. What did I say, verse 4? 14. Right before John 3:16.
Somewhere after 13, too.
Yeah, something like that. And just as an aside, it's interesting when you have often quoted verses like John 3:16 for you to go back and read the whole chapter before it and after it to get it in its proper context. But it's talking about Nicodemus and the new birth in the beginning of 3. And then when you get all the way down to 14, Jesus is making an explanation about what's to happen. And he says in verse 14, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And so that came to my mind this week, and I was thinking, I can't believe we covered Numbers and didn't really have that passage that has such a foundational point in the book of John. But, I mean, you can't cover it all unless you stay in there 6 months. So, we're in Numbers chapter 33 and 34. Now, if you looked at that this week, and I think I forgot to remind you to look at it, but if you have read from verse 1 all the way through 49 of chapter 33, your eyes were probably glazing over. But when I read all of those, I was trying to, and I lost count of, all the different places that they camped. And so really chapter 33, verses 1 through 49, is kind of a, what's the word we use when we go on a trip and we write everything down? Mert, you like to travel? Itinerary is before.
Travel log.
A journal of or something?
Travel log.
Travel log. That's basically what 33 is, because it's listing all the places that they stopped and they stayed over a 40-year period. And it wasn't like they were constantly wandering all the time. They stayed at several camps, so they were moving a lot, but not all of them were just one night. Many of them were a long period of time, and the signals were given about the light and the smoke and the cloud and all that kind of thing. But that's 1 through 49. And then we get to where we are today, and we're going to get some instructions about what to do when we cross over and get into the land of Canaan. So, I'm always driving up and down the interstate and trying to pay attention to what I'm driving, but my eyes go on both sides of the road, and I'm looking to see what's happening. And so, the last month or 2 or 3 or 5, going to Rolla, I'll notice back over here on just not past F too far, I watched them do something with a piece of land there, and they cleaned it off and they put something down. And of course, I'm asking questions, what's that going to be? And I find out what that is. It's a stockpile for something from clay pits, isn't it? And then you go further down to the west, and on the other side of the interstate, they've got this big barn thing coming up. And what's that? Well, I understand maybe that's where a lumberyard's going to relocate to. And is that right? And so you just keep noticing things. And sometimes you'll see a sign that'll pop up on a piece of property, and it'll say "future home of." And I have seen some of those signs pop up, and 10 years later, the sign's faded and the sign's still there. That may have been how the Israelites felt like, future home of, and the sign's fading, and we're wandering around, and what's going on. In the background of the lesson today, it talks about the early part, and there was a census taken. And they counted the people of the different tribes, but they were counting them to see who was of fighting age for the military. And then that's all recorded. And then we fast forward up to about where we are now. They're doing the same thing again, and they're seeing who's available. But the commentary said of all of those people, only 3 men were still living that were a part of that original census. Do you know who they were? Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. We buried Aaron recently. Well, we didn't bury him. He went up in the mountain and didn't come back. I don't know if he got buried up there or not, but he did that. Now Miriam's gone, their sister, and now just Moses. So that's kind of where we are. Got a little introductory paragraph that's kind of the direction I was talking. We've all seen it. The for sale sign is removed from the plot of land. Workers show up and conduct the survey, and you see the little stakes and the flags on them. Then they put little orange marker flags in the ground, and trenches and holes are cut and dug. The ground is leveled, concrete trucks show up, construction crews arrive at the site day after day. In a few months, the house or the subdivision or the apartment complex is complete. Every step occurred according to a plan that someone had developed. We're noticing that. You go back towards Cuba on the right-hand side, what used to be what was the name of that farm? Ridgetop. And there's going to be homes built in there. So we know what we're talking about, but why is it important to follow the plan when doing construction. Have any of you ever come upon a building a few years later that somebody didn't have a plan or didn't follow the plan? Some of you know that I did church facilities planning with Missouri Baptist Convention for over 30 years. And I remember bringing the architect from Nashville with me, and we pulled up at a church in Bonne Terre, Missouri. Two things were going on there. We pulled up and they had a new asphalt parking lot, and we looked at each other and said, I hope they're not thinking about building here, because we weren't sure what they wanted, because the only place to build is right where they just put this new asphalt parking lot. Ding. That's what they wanted to do. They didn't ever do it, but that was poor planning on their part, and they didn't do it. But when we walked into their educational building, this is something that was built probably in the 50s or 60s. We walked into the building, and we noticed that the floor was sagging on the second floor. And we started looking around, and they had, in all their wisdom, decided to add a second floor to that building sometime after the first floor was built. And they didn't line up the load-bearing walls for the second floor roof over the columns on the first floor. We had a lot of bad news for those people that day. First of all, if you don't do something about this building, it's going to fall in around you. And secondly, the only place you've got to build is where you put your new parking lot. So we were the bearer of bad news. But when you think about planning and planning ahead, to do it right, it takes a lot of time. And there were reasons why it took 40 years. Sometimes it's because 1,000 years is a day and a day is 1,000 years, according to the Lord. And sometimes he has to let some funerals happen before he will bless a congregation. Sometimes he will let maybe a group of people dwindle down and die, and what should have been their mission, a new church will sprout up and do what they should have done. It's all in God's timing. When we get there, we may have a lot of questions. Hey, remember back in Crawford County back in the 2000s, why did this happen? No, we're not going to do that because we're not going to care. We're going to be in the presence of the Lord. It won't matter. But when you think about obstructions to God's will, and you think about planning or not following the plan, all you have to do is look in God's Word and you see where it's happened, where people follow plan or where people don't follow plan. And the Israelites were good at not following plans sometimes. They had periods of doing a good job and other times when they didn't do so good. There are consequences of failure to follow a plan. Moses being one of those. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments. Let's look at verses 50 through 53. And I would like for us to maybe kind of look at those silently for a moment. We may have someone read them out loud in a minute. But before someone reads them, I want you to look them over and be familiar with it. And while you're doing that, kind of think about the directions that are being given. I'll give you a minute or two to read that. Have you had a chance to kind of look at it? Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan across from Jericho. Tell the Israelites, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their stone images and cast images, and demolish all their high places. You are to take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given you the land to possess. What things did you highlight in your mind that he told them to do? Specific things.
Get rid of all the people that
Get rid of them.
are whatever.
Okay. What else were they supposed to do?
Get rid of all the images.
All the images of the pagan worship. Get rid of that. The high places. Okay? Why do you think he told them that?
So they wouldn't be deterred from what God's plan for.
Because he knows his people.
He knows his people. He wanted to remove the distractions from them. The land was their promised land. That was where they were to go. But the only way they were going to ever get that land was by being obedient to him. And so they'd already wandered for 40 years because of disobedience. And now the time has come, and there's a new generation. They've been counted. They've had their census. And we know who's of fighting age, and we know of what group they're from, which clan or which tribe that they're from. Basically, the 12 tribes, and we may talk about that in a minute if we have a chance. I gave somebody Numbers 20, verse 12. I think that's Glennon. Read that verse for us, please.
Okay. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because ye believe not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them.
Who did he say that to? Moses and Aaron. Well, he took care of Aaron. Aaron's time was up and he passed away. But Moses was still alive. Moses got to see them go in, but he couldn't go. And that was because of disobedience. And so sin has its consequences many times for us. So they were camped there. They were looking at the promised land. They saw what was across the Jordan and the place that they could possess. I think it's interesting in verse 50, the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. And he said to Moses, tell the Israelites, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan. Wasn't any doubt about it, was it? When you cross, this is what you're going to encounter. Then he was very particular about what must happen. You must drive out all of the inhabitants, all of them. Now, many times we feel like that in order to have peace, we have to come up with a compromise, right? You know, our current president calls himself the deal maker, you know. And so, and we had great statesmen like years ago, Henry Kissinger, and you know, you just go back through history, and some of you are better history students than I am, would begin to name people that were able to take a couple of groups and to sit down and work out a compromise for peace. In this setting, and there are settings in the Bible where there are compromises made, but this isn't one of them. The instructions were it didn't say necessarily kill them, but you must drive out all of the inhabitants before you. And then, I don't care how cute that little statue is, or how nice that monument is, destroy it, because it represents a pagan god. And so they were to do that. You're to drive out the inhabitants, you're to destroy all of the stone images and cast images, and demolish all of their high places. Now, if you'll fast forward in the Old Testament, you'll find out they did part of what they were supposed to do, and they didn't do it all. And there are consequences for that. In fact, they continued to worship on the high places for whatever reason, and that's for another day. Then he says in verse 53, you are to take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given you the land to possess. When you think about taking possession of something, what does that look like? Have any of you ever purchased a piece of property? Anybody in the room ever purchased a piece of property? What happens when you purchase it? You take possession of it. What happens when you start taking possession of a piece of property?
You try to make it your own.
You make it your own. How many times have I heard the realtors say, we got realtors in the room, they'll say to old guys like me who like golden oak cabinets that we put in our homes 20 or 30 years ago, don't you even think about doing anything to your kitchen, because if you go to sell your house, first thing that young lady's going to do is she's going to go in there and paint those pretty golden oak cabinets. She's going to paint them white or whatever. And I've observed that with my daughter, they bought a bunch of houses through the years, and one of the most recent ones was in O'Fallon, Illinois, which had a nice looking kitchen in it. Very first thing she did in it was go in there and paint those cabinets. Oh, well, that's okay. That's her house. She made it hers. She possessed it. But that's what he's talking about. I want you to own it. I want you to possess it. I want you to settle in it. Now, when you settle somewhere, what do? Till the land, you do whatever. You know, this becomes yours, and that was God's plan, and that's what they were to do. Why do you think it was important for them, even though they had driven out the previous inhabitants? Why was it important for them to destroy the idols that were devoted to false gods? Because none of them believed in that. Wasn't it just a pretty statue? There would always be that temptation, that interest. What is this? What's this about? Let's research this. He says, don't go there. Flee from that kind of thing. And God knew that the idolatry in Canaan would distract the Israelites, and those were instructions that were very important to them. The part about the high places is referenced in 1 Kings 3, 1 Kings 15, 2 Kings 14, and 15, where they continued, for whatever reason, out of rebellion, I guess, to worship on high places in the land throughout their history, even though their intent was, this is a good place to worship, but we'll worship the Lord God here. That wasn't the instruction. And so they were disobedient in what they did. Let's look at the next set of verses. Believers can expect to encounter challenges while following God. Have you encountered any challenges when you try to say, I'm going to, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord? Have you had any challenges when you make that kind of a commitment? What kind of challenges, or why? Why have you had challenges, you think?
Pretty little trinkets.
Distractions.
Distractions.
Yeah. Little trinkets. Yeah. Could be that. Big trinkets. Yeah. Could be that too. Yeah. What else? What are the challenges come around?
Full schedules.
Schedules? Full schedules.
Schedules seem to fill up. We try to distract you away from distractions.
Actually, no room for God, maybe.
Mhm.
Okay. So why do these things happen? Human nature, maybe. Maybe that's why. God knows us. That's kind of why he gave the instructions about what to do and what not to do. But nonetheless, they didn't always follow that. So somebody read, Holden, you got your reading glasses on? Or you're too young, you don't need reading glasses. Okay. Would you read 54 through 56 for us?
Well, distribute the land by lot according to your plans. To a larger group, give a larger inheritance, and to a smaller group, a smaller one. Whatever falls to them by lot will be theirs, distributed according to your ancestral tribes. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you live. And then I will go to you, and then I will go to you what I plan to do to them.
Okay, thank you, Holden. So Holden read 54 through 56. And if you were following along with him, you probably saw there were two categories in those verses that he talked about. One was promises, and the other were consequences. Just look back through that real quick and tell me what some of the promises were that would happen.
To divide the land among them
Okay, and elaborate on that, Glenn.
by clans, or
Divide land
by clans.
by clans. And I think in other places it talks about the reason for the division being different. It had to do with the population. So the larger clans got larger pieces of land. Okay, that was a promise. Any other promises that you see in those verses?
Driving the inhabitants out.
Promise inheritance.
An inheritance. Okay. All right. Have you got more promises? Or you want to jump over to consequences? This is where it gets kind of graphic, depending on your translation. What's some of the consequences in those verses?
If they don't drive the people that are out, they will be irritants and they will be amongst them.
Oh, you're using a nice, kind word, irritant.
There would still be distractions.
What was another word for that irritant to their eye?
Barbs.
Barbs. That kind of hurts just thinking about that. Have anybody ever got anything in their eye? And when I think of a barb, I guess I think of a barbed wire fence, but I mean, there can be other kinds of sharp objects that could, what could that happen if it's not treated right?
It annoys you to blink, it annoys you not to blink.
Yeah, that's the irritant part, but it could even cause blindness, couldn't it? Okay. What's some other consequences of maybe if they're disobedient? Punishment? Back again to what we were talking about earlier, sin has its consequences, right? Okay, any other things in there as far as consequences that you see or promise?
They shall bet you in the land.
Say it again,
Give
Glenn.
them trouble.
Say it again.
They bet you in the land. They'll give them trouble, or in other words, I don't know how to explain that, but it says it, but vex.
What was the word that you used? Your translation, what did it say?
Mine said harass. He says vex.
Vex?
He said vex. Mine said harass.
Okay, vex is a good King James word. Harass, how do you spell harass?
I don't know. 1 R.
One R or two?
I don't know. Hang on.
1 hour.
One R. Okay. Has anybody ever been vexed? You might not have known you were vexed because you don't speak King James. But have you ever been harassed? You know what they mean? It's not good, is it? And that's almost a little bit like the irritant. It's just kind of, I'm saying it a bunch of different ways for you to get your point, to get the point across that I've given you a task. So the task was to drive out how many of the inhabitants? All. And how many of the idols was I to destroy? And what was I supposed to do to all the high places? Yeah, knock them all down. I was supposed to do all that. Should I only do part of the task, I may think that, well, that's a good compromise. Let's just do that. But you know what happens? I'm then going to have these irritants. It may not be the barb that puts your eye out, but it's the one that Eric talked about where it hurts if I close my eye or I open my eye. It's just a constant irritant. And then the idea of harassment, and you can think about what that looks like. It don't ever go away. I mean, it's always there. I don't want to get too personal, but if you've ever had a bad neighbor, and whatever the irritant is about that neighbor, whether it's the trash they throw on your property or the dog that gets in your whatever, you just on and on. You can think of what that is. It just don't ever go away. It's just, oh no, not again. That's the kind of thing that he's talking about here, about the consequences of their disobedience. Pat, I gave you a couple of verses, one in Proverbs and one in Acts. Pat's going to read Proverbs 16:33 and Acts 1:26 for us.
Okay, Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its ever decision is from the Lord."
Okay.
And then the other one is, then they cast lots, and the lot fell to Matthias, so he was added to the 11 apostles.
Okay, and so that's the reason I wanted to look at that, was because in these verses you're to receive the land as an inheritance. Okay, increase the inheritance for the clan, decreased on size of the inheritance. That's why partially why the census was taken, and whatever place the lot indicates for someone will be his. Why would God tell them to gamble for the consequences? It really isn't. It's rigged. What did Pat just read us? What does it say again about lots in that setting?
It said the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord.
Every decision is from the Lord. It's like, go ahead and cast the lots, but here's how it's going to happen. This is my plan. And in that sense, it's God's plan in that. And I thought those were important verses kind of to back up that, because I could just hear people saying, well, why would they cast lots for that? It's kind of like when they had to choose the new disciple. They cast lots for that. Isn't that right? Now what happened after Judas? But we all know that God had chosen the person. So why it's done that way, I'm not sure. Got an answer for you. But I think the important thing was read in the verses that Pat shared, is that God determines. And so God did. He determined what would happen and how it would happen. Then he talks about these consequences in these verses and the promises that are in the verses. Are there any principles or applications that you and I can draw out of this situation in Numbers that would maybe help us live a more obedient life toward God? Anything come to your mind? A principle? What are you laughing about, Glennon?
Follow instructions.
Follow instructions. All of them or just part of them? Yeah. Is that Danny over there? Have you ever put anything together that had instructions with it, Dan? She's laughing. I don't want to cause any family problems here.
After I can't figure it out.
After you can't figure it out. Have you ever had any pieces left over?
Always.
Always. Yeah. I think most of us understand that. But in this setting, we're talking about that a principle that he's giving them is, I want you to do all that I have asked you to do. God has a plan. However, guys like Spencer sometimes think, well, but I've got an idea. How about this? You know, we've talked about this in weeks before where sometimes our tendency is to go to God and say, I've got this great idea. I want you to bless it. Whereas I think it was last week we quoted something from the Henry Blackaby discipleship series of 40 years ago, where a principle in that series or that discipleship class was this: look around and see where God's working and join him in it. So sometimes my prayer ought to be not, God, would you bless this great idea I've got, but God, would you open my eyes to see what you're doing and then allow me to be a part of that. Use me in a way that would glorify your kingdom and be what you would have for me to be. And so sometimes we just are asking the wrong questions, perhaps, and we're not being obedient. And really that sums up what we're supposed to be doing in these verses. So a principle for them, of course, would be that to avoid the thorn or the barb, the discomfort and the pain, and even possibly an infection. You know, we didn't even talk about that. You know, we got at least one nurse in the room. What happens if something goes untreated? It's an infection, and an infection is not treated. What happens? It just worse and worse. And so that's kind of what is going on here. That could be a consequence of our wrong actions. Okay, we're gonna. If you've got your Bible open, we see that we've just finished up with 54 through 56, which ends the chapter. And then we're jumping ahead in chapter 34, excuse me, where it's talking about the boundaries for the clans. And we've talked about the fact that we had a couple of census. One was at the beginning of the 40 years, and then just right up here at the end of the 40 years, we've had another one. And the census were for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was to determine the males of fighting age for military purposes and strength. That was one reason for the census. But one of the larger reasons at this point in the game, at the end of the 40 years, was to determine the size of the real estate for the clans. Because they were all going to be blessed equally, but they would have different size inheritance because of the size of their clan. And the clan means the size of their extended family, the group, whether it be, and you go through the 12 tribes and that kind of thing. So that's what's going on here. Then we're going to jump down to verses 13 through 15 is where we're going to look. And so I think one of the points that I want to make, maybe we've made it strong enough already when we looked at promises and consequences, but I want you to realize, and I want me to realize, that one of the things that's important to know is God keeps his promises.
That's right.
You know? And so I have known people through the years that I guess the jury was out whether this person's going to be my friend or not. I mean, I kind of like this person and we get along pretty well, but maybe the track record after a few years is I'm backing off because this guy is not a person of his word. He'll tell you one thing and do something else. Well, that's maybe human nature, and we all fail, and we may fail each other. But God keeps his promises. He keeps his promises, good and bad. He promised, if you do these things, this will happen. And he promised that if you don't do them, there will be consequences. It's out of our hands. I mean, we had the opportunity, but there are consequences for sin, and that's a little bit about what this plan is about. So God keeps his promises, both good and bad. If you've got 35 open, you begin to see that there are descriptions of the size of real estate and where the cities that the Levites will have, and the cities of refuge, and all of that kind of thing. And it's interesting reading if you don't understand what the cities of refuge were. Maybe not the same thing as we think of today. It was a place where you could go if you accidentally killed someone, and you wouldn't have the retribution of the relatives. You know, if you murdered somebody, that was one thing, but if it were a manslaughter type of case, maybe a city of refuge was part of that. And then that's all described in. You can read that right before you take a nap, because it's there and it's verbose and it's there. But we're going to talk about the last portion of these verses. We're going to get into, well, not really, the middle portion actually, 13 through 15. And it says, and the cities which you give shall have 6 cities of refuge. You shall appoint 3 cities on the side of the Jordan, and 3 cities you shall appoint in the land of Canaan, which will be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be the refuge for children of Israel, the stranger and the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills a person accidentally may flee there. So that was an important part of that. It also talks about cities being on both sides of Canaan. You may have thought that all 12 tribes would go into Canaan, but we find that there were 9.5 tribes that went in and 2.5 tribes that stayed on the other side. In looking through this over the last several days, it seems like maybe the reason for the tribe staying on the one side was because of the pasture land there for livestock. They were granted that, they were given permission of that, but they were also a conditional promise. They said, okay, we'll let you raise your sheep and cattle or whatever on this side, and we understand all that, so we'll let you have that. But here's the deal. Your relatives are going to cross over the Jordan, and they're going to inhabit the land, but they're going to have to drive out, and sometimes drive out that was talked about as far as the task was more than driving them out. It was fighting them. It was war. It was takeover, and you're going to agree to help the other Israelites do that, and then when you have done that, you can come back and you can have your land for the 2.5 tribes on that particular side. And so the 9.5 tribes would be in the area of Canaan west of the Jordan, and that's a part of what's in chapter 21, I believe, of Numbers and so forth. The geographical boundaries that are laid out doubtless were just like 40 years ago when Joshua and Caleb and how many more people? 10 more? Was it 12 that went in? How many spies were there? Was it 11 or 12? I forgot. Didn't matter. I think it was 12. How many? It's 12? 10 and 2? Yeah. Okay, so when they went in, they came back and 10 gave a negative report and 2 gave the good report, the honest report. Of course, who's living now? The 2 that gave the good report. Okay, now here's kind of what they're expecting. Okay, when you guys cross over, there's going to be people watching. You may think there's nobody here, but the Indians are in the hills. They're watching. They're paying attention to what's going on, and so that will be there. And so there was instructions on what is to take place, and how that they are to do that. So that's part of that. I think one of the things that I want us to realize is that we're back to the point of God's instructions. The instructions that are given is basically what we said the title of the lesson was, which is portion of 33 and 34. We talked about the land, we talked about the task, and now we're there. We're in the land, and the plan is to carry forth what has been promised, and to do that in a way that that would please God. So in these verses, it talks about the tribes and the descendants and what they will have, and receiving their inheritance that was promised many years ago, and what they're supposed to do. So when you see this, there are some things that maybe we can draw from that. I've already mentioned that one of the things you can draw out of this is that we can trust God to keep His promises, and we've already alluded to good promises and bad promises. So promises and consequences kind of fits into what we're talking about there. But how do God's promises to you and I and to the Israelite people serve as a motivator to remain faithful to Him? Now, they had short memories, right? What did they call that man a while ago in that verse I read, that background verse? I'm so sick and tired of this. Was it worthless or something, you know? But it was manna from heaven. It was God's provision. They were looking down their nose at it. They last week were reminiscing about how great it was when we were in Egypt. Oh, it was great, wasn't it? Let's really think about how great it was. You were in slavery. You didn't have enough to eat. When you complained, they took the straw out of the bricks you were making and made it twice as hard to do it. And on and on and on. We have all that took place. And they were reminded of that. So the question I'm asking is, how does God's promises serve as a motivator to remain faithful to Him? I've given you kind of a negative when we have a tendency to not remember things as they were. But what should we be doing when God asks us to do something? How do we prepare to be faithful? How about track record?
Yeah, remembering how He's been faithful in the past.
Remembering how He's been faithful in the past. So why is it important? You know, we're halfway past October, and the next big holiday is deer season, and then it's Thanksgiving, right? And you know, we ought to spend a whole lot of time thinking about Thanksgiving. We ought to enumerate how God has blessed. God, I'm getting older. I don't know how on earth I'm going to make it. I'm getting old. You know, I got aches and pains. And then God's going to help me remember. Do you remember when you had two teenagers? Some of you had a whole bunch more than that. You made through that. Remember when you didn't even have enough money to buy groceries when you were newly married? You thought, man, if we can just not spend anything for a week, we'll eat whatever's in the cabinet and do without the rest of the time. Anybody else been there? I mean, you just have to look back and say, God, you've been faithful. And that's how we are motivated to remain faithful. God, you have been good, and God, you will be good. And that's important for us, because we have to remember the blessings that we've had. And we have to remember that when we pick on the Israelites, they're not a whole lot different than Crawford County-ites or Washington County-ites. What other ites we got in here?
Jefferson County.
Jefferson County-ites. My goodness, what county are you from? You're from another state, Pennsylvania. People are people, aren't they? And they have short memories. And so one of the things that we've learned in the Old Testament about when they didn't have volumes written, books, they didn't have all this, how did they teach the younger people? Oral. They told the stories. I may have mentioned to you before, I sure have mentioned it to people that grew up in the same era that I did, that when I was a child, it was expected that every Sunday afternoon we went to Grandma and Grandpa's for lunch. The women were in one room and the men were in the other. And I don't know why, but that's just the way it was. I'm not saying it was good or bad, or that's the way it was. And one of the things that I remember, because I was one of the older grandchildren, is that if I would sit quietly around those old men, they were old, they were probably 40 or so, Grandpa might have been 60, And if I would listen, they would talk about oral history around Crawford County. Why, don't you remember that was the old Summers place over there? Don't you remember this? Why, he married her and all this kind of stuff. And you think, well, is that old men gossip? No, it's oral tradition. It's oral tradition is what it is. It was verbal history. And I think that's something maybe we have lost now. But what I'm saying about that is that's the way they did it in the Old Testament times. The father told the son, and it wasn't just the telling of stories about who owns what property, but it was the recitation of God's law and God's commands. And since they didn't have books to read and to memorize and to mark, they would learn it by oral transition, and they would say it and they would repeat it, and then they would do that for the next generation. And so that's part of what's going on. And part of what they did was they would repeat the stories of how God had blessed them. But what has happened here, what's one of the D words that we say Satan is to us? Deceiver. And another one, distractor. I mean, we could give a whole bunch of D words, but those are two good ones. We'll just stop there. The deceiver and the distractor. What does he cause me to remember? The bad stuff. He causes me to forget the good times. He causes me to forget how I got there, and I get to using I in my stories a whole lot. Eric, I did this and I did that, and I and sometimes you just want to say, Spencer, shut up and listen to what you're saying. God provided. God blessed. And so the Israelite people had a plan, and their plan was to remember and to follow through on what God had asked them to do. And of course, you probably know that they had ups and downs with that. But in conclusion of where we're going to stop in Numbers, I would want you to think of these things. First of all, following God often requires believers to remove potential distractions. We talked about Satan using distractions. Maybe one of the reasons that all of the stonework and the idols and the wonderful, talented images that had been made, surely there's no harm in any of this. Why they were told to be destroyed is because they would be a distraction, and it would cause people to stumble. And so remove them. Then the second thing is believers can expect to encounter challenges while following God. You can expect to find challenges. When it's not going to be a rose garden. It's not going to be without thorns, but to expect and to be prepared to follow God regardless. And we can trust God to keep his promises. Any statements that you want to make or comments about what we've talked about in this Numbers passage? Anybody? Okay. Well, let's close in prayer. Father, we're thankful that when we look at an Old Testament passage like this, we do see a lot of history, and sometimes we shake our heads at the Israelites, but if we look in the mirror, we'd see a lot of resemblance to them. And so when we think about this and try to make application, we're thankful for what you show us in Scripture. And the reason it's there is to help us learn maybe from others' mistakes, but more than that, to learn that you are a God who keeps his promises. You're a God who is faithful and a God who cares about his people. And we just pray that we would remember that, and we would share that with others. We would help others to see that, and we would live that out before them. Be with us as we go into our time of worship today. We pray for our pastor as he brings a message laid on his heart. We ask all this now in your name. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Tommy, you think I end this thing?
Oh, sorry, I was talking.
That's all right. Now that